Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the Closing the Gender Wealth Gap series. Today's conversation is a part of a larger series whose purpose is to educate our community about the drivers of the gender wealth gap and solutions that will impact the economic well-being of women. Since 2020, we've conducted sessions in these series focused on a variety of topics, equity and grant making to narrative storytelling, student loan debt, and more. Today's session will focus on wealth supremacy, and we're very excited to partner with the Free Library of Philadelphia to host author Marjorie Kelly to discuss this important topic with Women's Way Chief Disruptor Diane Cornman-Levy. My name is Kelly Sheard. I am the director of the Gender Wealth Institute within Women's Way, and I'm very happy you all are with us today to get into the good stuff. So welcome. While we wait for folks to sign on, I would appreciate you taking the poll. We want to know if this is your first time attending a Women's Way event. If you are a first timer, welcome to the community. If you are a returner, we're glad to have you back. So I'll start off with just a few logistics. This presentation will be recorded, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions to the speakers via the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to address as many of your questions as possible. This discussion will also be in English with simultaneous interpretation in Spanish, so everyone will need to select a language. To choose your language, follow these instructions. If you are on a computer, you will see a globe pop up on the bottom of the screen. Click on the globe and select the language you speak. If you are on a phone, you will see 3 dots on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Click on those, click on Language Interpretation, and then select the language you speak. If you have any questions about the interpretation feature, please put them in the chat and someone will assist you. Closed captioning is enabled, so if you do not want to see closed captioning, you can click Hide CC at the bottom of your screen. The chat is also enabled, so please share your comments during the session. To create a safer space for all of us to engage in honest and challenging discussions, we ask each of you to abide to the session norms, which are listed in the chat box. Finally, we will record the session and make it available for you to view again and for those who could not attend today's session. After the session, we will also send you a list of resources related to today's topic and a survey to evaluate the session. We deeply value your input as we work to continually improve these educational forums. There we go. Before we get to the meat of our presentation and discussion, we want to thank our program partner, Madre Tierra, for their generous support of translation and interpretation services. We're excited to be able to increase our language access and broaden our community through their dedicated partnership. So first, if you are new to the series, a word on who we are. Women's Way is the region's leading gender and racial justice organization dedicated to the advancement of women, girls, and gender and racial equity. Within Women's Way, we have the Gender Wealth Institute. At GWI, our work is to advance research and practical solutions to close the gender wealth gap in our region. First, we want to begin by sharing our definition of wealth, developed by the brilliant minds at the Maven Collaborative. When wealth is accumulated, we live and retire with greater dignity, freedom, and peace of mind. Our communities are prosperous, resilient, and vibrant. Future generations have the freedom to dream big and become all they truly can be. We are healthy and know that our families, networks, and communities are healthy, spiritually whole, and contributing. At Women's Way, when we talk about accumulating a wealth that is worthwhile, this is what we mean. When we talk about closing the gender wealth gap, we believe our work has to be functioning in a variety of levels, from changes in the structure of society to changes in how we relate to one another, to changes in how we organize our thinking. To close the gender wealth gap, we have to shift the conditions that keep gender and racial wealth gaps in place. Racial wealth gaps, gender wealth gaps, we know these are not the byproducts of widespread group deficiencies, but rather the outcomes of intentional design. Where there is overflow, there is a deliberate choice to hoard and protect. Where there is scarcity, there is a deliberate choice to extract and deny. Part of our work is to begin to better understand the conditions, decisions, and choices that have led us to the experience of wealth gaps so that we can identify opportunities to create new realities. What I'd like to offer is a simple framing of questions, familiar 4Ws, as a way to organize our thinking. The value of asking questions is that it provides a way to help us sort information. So let's start with the who. White supremacy, racialized patriarchy, racialized capitalism. These are all distinct but interlocking logics that attempt to explain how bias and harm is enacted and upon whom. In the places where there's overlap, we can find meaning making because it highlights how constructed definitions provide a pretext, a rationale, and a procedure for domination and exploitation. Mm-hmm. Constructed definitions of identity have been sites where we play out our national narratives around deservedness, worthiness, and value. Indeed, the American ethos around meritocracy is a national motto of sorts, not only about the foundation of this country, but also about who deserves what. Mm-hmm. We tell each other the myth of the self-made individual, or the idea that hard work can make anything possible. We tell each other the myth that America is a free and equal society, that is, that choices and opportunities abound for everyone. We tell each other the myth that individual effort is rewarded with material success. But do our actual lived experiences bear these ideals out? Why don't we ask questions about the conditions that create the statistical norms? That is, the vast majority of us. If we looked around at the conditions that we all struggle with, we would have to explore and challenge the machinations that lead to widespread outcomes such as wealth inequality. More questions for us to consider on this slide. Mm-hmm. Now moving to what. One of the great misunderstandings about the economy is that it is a natural, divine, and sacred system of truths. In fact, the economy is constructed. That is, we made it up. They made it up. We made it up. We're all complicit in some way, as the economy is simply a series of decisions and choices, malleable, able to shift, able to be built or destroyed. What this implies is that a wealth gap is not a series of widespread individual failures, but a consequence of intentional design. As we learn about the system design, the decisions, the choices, and the intention, we should be critical about how the design affects different groups of people in different ways with differing levels of impact, and in so many cases, destruction. Here, it is helpful to remember the theory pioneered by Black feminists, intersectionality. Mm-hmm. Intersectionality is not merely the overlap of various identities, it's a systems analysis of power relationships. As we learn and unearth the system design that creates such widespread wealth inequality, we want to keep this framework of intersectionality in mind. Progress that moves along a single axis, race only, gender only, leaves structures of injustice intact. For an economy that works for everyone, we have to contest power in its multiple forms, as multiple dimensions of power shape our life chances. As Audre Lorde taught us, we do not live single-issue lives, and our struggle for liberation won't be achieved in a singular fashion. More questions for consideration on the slide. Now moving to where. Here, it may be helpful to think about social structures, social institutions, social norms, and how they interact within a capitalist economy. First, a definition. Social structures are the stable patterns of relationships existing in a particular society or group. In a capitalist society where few people control the labor of many, the social structure reflects a system of relationships based on domination amongst categories of people. Next, let's define social institutions. Social institutions are a set of organized beliefs and rules that establish how society will attempt to meet its basic social needs. Examples of institutions include the family, religion, education, government, and more. In a capitalist society, social institutions are places where we uphold the idea that property rights are more important than the needs of individuals or communities, and that unlimited profit is a divine right. Finally, the idea of social norms, that is, widely accepted groups, statuses, roles, and behaviors. In a capitalist economy, the disadvantages of workers are necessary for the advantages of the owners. This exploitation, normed, embedded, and recast as the deficit of the individual, is what sets the stage for extraction. More questions for consideration on the slide. Moving to when. Here I offer that it's important to study when there have been collective demonstrations of power that have channeled rewards, resources, and opportunities away from the global majority into the hands of the created elite. As an example, what were the pivotal moments in history when whiteness was created and endowed with social and economic advantages? Through what means? By way of which champions? How did the mainstream feminist movement grow to be conceptualized as the fight for women's rights? Which women? And what rights? What does our history tell us? Past offers us clues to a blueprint of domination and a logic of extraction. What can we learn about these processes, and where do we see similar movements happening today? More questions for consideration on the slide. Why? As we learn more about the various logics that attempt to explain our lived experience, racialized capitalism, racialized patriarchy, extractive capitalism, cis heteropatriarchy, and more, it's enough to make your head spin. One way I attempt to make sense of it is to try to understand how these logics explain who is valued or what is valued and how they're protected. I ask myself how these frameworks deepen my understanding and what I can do to use these understandings to influence the decisions and choices that are within my purview. Feelings of paralysis, hopelessness, and overwhelm are common and they're understandable. What helps me as I continue to study, as I seek to better understand, is to attempt to answer the questions of what will I do with this? Who else is doing something with this? And how do I join them? Or questions for consideration on the slide. How? Andrea Smith wrote an important piece titled Heteropatriarchy and the Three Pillars of White Supremacy, which is linked in the resources we'll send out after today's discussion. What I want to take the opportunity to uplift here is the idea that the goal of our resistance is to develop strategies that topple various systems of oppression, as they're all interrelated. As a feminist organization, it's extremely important that we expand our focus to various dimensions of privilege so that we don't risk enacting harm in the name of women's rights. There are many logics to contend with, and part of the work is to understand how these logics work together to uphold the interest of the dominant. Logics prop up structures. Structures produce and exercise power. Exploring logics, including biases, is what helps us to imagine new ones, new foundations that support us in the ways that we want. As with all of our Closing the Gender Wealth Gap series, our goal today is to introduce you to ideas and concepts, trailblazers, and great thinkers, as you are all a part of the collective that will help shape the future. Now on to the discussion. I'm pleased to be able to introduce Diane Cornman-Levy. Diane brings more than 30 years of nonprofit leadership, coalition building, community organizing, and fundraising experience to Women's Way. A tireless advocate for gender and racial equity, Diane joined Women's Way in January 2017 after running for state representative of the 168th District. Prior to running for public office, Diane founded and built two nonprofits and led another nonprofit organization that worked to improve education, health, and economic equity for families. In each of these positions, Diane challenged the status quo through forging cross-sector partnerships and designing new programs that increased economic, health, and education opportunities for families, teens, returning citizens, and self-taught artists with mental health challenges. During her tenure at Women's Way, she led the transformation of the organization, including designing a new brand, creating new grant-making programs, building a citywide collaborative initiative to advance the economic security of women, and leading a year-long intervention to embed anti-racism in every aspect of Women's Way. Diane currently is a member of the Forum of Executive Women and two forum committees, Pay Equity and Public Sector Leadership Committees, and a board member of the nonprofit organization Live Well. We are thrilled to welcome our featured author, Marjorie Kelly, to this discussion. Marjorie Kelly is a distinguished senior fellow with the Democracy Collaborative and the author of our featured text today, Wealth Supremacy: How the Extractive Economy and the Biased Rules of Capitalism Drive Today's Crises. Her previous works include The Making of a Democratic Economy, co-authored with Ted Howard, Owning Our Future: The Emerging Ownership Revolution, and The Divine Right of Capital. She describes herself as a spy within the house of business for decades. In Wealth Supremacy, she unpacks the capital bias and wealth supremacy threaded throughout the practices and institutions of that world, invisibly but relentlessly causing multiple crises of our day. While Kelly's previous writing has focused almost exclusively on the positive, her recent book offers a warning about the unseen dangers of wealth supremacy, which threatens to devour the positive, democratic economy models thousands of visionaries have built. The movement we are called to will be one of equal parts outrage and love. Welcome, Marjorie, and welcome, Diane.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you so much. You want to stop showing the slides?
Yes, yes.
Well, welcome all. Welcome all. And Kelly, as always, you do the most provocative, interesting presentation. And I think those questions that you shared with everyone, hopefully is opening everyone's minds up, because this conversation that I'm about to have with Marjorie Kelly is going to hopefully, is going to be one of great depth. And hopefully provoke you to learn many new things. So again, thank you for joining the first Closing the Gender Wealth Gap Forum, where I had the privilege and honor to have this very important conversation with Marjorie Kelly. Marjorie, I read your book, Wealth Supremacy, and not only did I read it once, I have read several chapters, probably 3 or 4 times. I've underlined things, circled things, exclamation, because there's so much depth to this book. And I have to say, it's the best book I've ever read that really explains how our current economic system that is built on wealth extraction is the root cause of the many crises we are currently facing, including the growing gender and racial wealth gap. So my first question is, because I think this is your 4th book that you've written, what inspired you to write Wealth Supremacy?
Yeah, I've become discouraged. I have spent more than 30 years working for a democratic economy, and as a journalist and a theorist and a consultant. And I have tracked the work of literally thousands of visionaries who are building what we need, different kinds of banks, different kinds of companies, different kinds of investments. That work is so far advanced. I think it would blow people's minds if they could begin to grasp how much has been worked out about building a different economy. And yet things are getting worse and not better, ecologically, politically, in terms of wealth inequality for people of color, for women, for working people. Things are worse. And, we're heading into a massive crisis. And I call it the problem that we're not talking about yet. We're talking about Trump. We're talking about climate. We're not talking about the fact that wealth is creating a lot of the crises that we're in. And so I kind of got mad. I say, and Kelly, your opening was so remarkable. I feel like almost like my work is done and I can go home. We'll just let Kelly carry on the dialogue because you really get it. And so we're not talking about this deep bias that the whole thing is upholding wealth. And I wanted to turn and shine a light on that and say, this is the problem we need to start talking about because it's creating multiple crises.
Yeah, so Kelly talked about this, that, Women's Way, we're working to really advance gender and racial equity, right? And help close the gender wealth gap. But in order to create a more equitable economic system where all women thrive, we need to understand how our current economic system works, which Kelly's was talking about, right? So we cannot fix a problem we cannot name. In your book, you wrote that we participate in systems change when we change our minds, and changing our minds begins with naming. You go on to say that naming is a way of breaking the silences that enfold and entrap us, a way of shining light into the unseen ways that culture and language shape our way of seeing the world, rendering our very lives invisible, even to ourselves. Really deep. So naming really shapes reality. So let's talk about two key concepts that I think that you write about in your book that people really need to understand. And of course, one is wealth supremacy and capital bias. How do you define these, and what are some examples of them in action?
Let me back up for a moment and talk about this issue of naming and breaking the silences. I mean, I'm old enough that I lived through second wave feminism. It was just out of college when feminism arrived in Missouri, where I grew up, and it completely blew my mind that sexism had existed for thousands of years, and by naming it and explaining it, I just saw the world in a completely different way. And I learned from feminist scholars of language how language completely shaped our reality. I mean, just use the word mankind, right? And he was the generic. And women, when I was a younger woman, you were either Miss or Mrs. You were either married or not married. So language completely shaped our idea of who we were. Well, that really taught me a lot. And I took that intellectual tradition and I turned it on capitalism. And I talk about how language shapes how we see the economy. And I'll just say quickly, for example, billionaires have more worth than deadbeats who can't pay their bills. So someone's net worth right there, that tells us who matters and who doesn't. Okay, so, and I deliberately am playing off of course, white supremacy when I devised this term wealth supremacy, because what I'm trying to say is the whole thing is illegitimate. We know that racism is illegitimate. We know that sexism is illegitimate. They're not gone, but by taking their legitimacy, we have really undercut them. And that's what I'm after here. I'm trying to show us how we can undercut the legitimacy of this system. So wealth supremacy, what is that? That's a cultural norm about who matters and who doesn't, who rightly holds power and who doesn't. I mean, we know the wealthy control politics, control culture. They're the rock stars of our society. We write about them. So wealth supremacy is this cultural norm. And then, so capital bias is how wealth supremacy is carried out. How do you keep the wealthy on top and comfortable and rolling in more and more money every year? Well, you do it because the system favors capital, and capital is the active face of wealth. That's what we can think of it as. When you put money to work, which of course we do through investing, nobody sits on a pile of cash, it's always invested. Then the rules of the system favor capital. They empower capital. They seek to grow capital. Capital is the whole center of the system, and that's why I use the phrase capital-ism. So we have racism, sexism, and capitalism. They're all systems of bias.
Yeah, and I think it's so, going back to the whole concept of naming narratives, right? And we do a lot of work around narratives change, and I think that's why so much time and effort and money is put into controlling narratives, right? Because narratives control our mental models. That's how we describe things and understand things. So so I want to get back to that later, because I think it's so critical. And I just want to share two data points that were from your book in terms of how this wealth gap is playing out. And I want people to just really sit with these data points. During the past 2 years, the wealth of the world's 10 richest men doubled, while the incomes of 99% of humanity fell. The wealthiest 10 people now own more than 40% of all humanity. I'm just going to say that again. The wealthiest 10 people now own more wealth than 40% of all humanity. So how is that sustainable, right? How, to hear that, how are we not outraged, right? And Margie, I'm right there with you. I have so much anger. Of course, that drives my work. And then another data point was Elon Musk, in a single year of the COVID pandemic, gained about $118 billion. In that same year, the United Nations estimated that 150 million people fell into poverty. This is not only not sustainable, I mean, it's harming millions and millions and millions of people, right? So I want to talk more about wealth supremacy and how it's upheld and how it works. Another important concept you talk about is financialization, right? And how it drives today's crises. Well, what is financialization? And how is it really deepening the gender and racial wealth gap?
Yeah. So let's go back to this notion of this wealth inequality and these 10 men who now have 40% of the world's wealth. What I point to in the book and what I've learned over decades is that the system is designed to do precisely this. I've lectured at more business schools than I can count, right? Business schools teach that the purpose of corporations is to maximize returns to shareholders. That is common. That's how corporations are structured. Corporations are designed to do this. It's enforced in the courts. It's, of course, the assumption of the Wall Street Journal. When Exxon is out there, Exxon last year, in 2022, gained 80%. Its market value, its share value went up 80%. And this is at the time when the world is on fire and cities are being flooded. Exxon is not an outlier. It is doing exactly the norm of what the system tells it to do, what any business school professor would tell it it's supposed to do. And also, by the way, it's what the CEO is being paid to do. And if he doesn't do it, he'll get fired. So we have to understand that this problem is systemic. And so it's these 10 people. One of the things I say in the book is, if you took every billionaire, if you took every hedge fund manager, every director of a corporation, and if they were abducted by aliens tomorrow, nothing would change. The system would reconstitute itself overnight, because where the system resides is in our minds. It's in the norms and the ideas and the mind. So let's talk about one wealthy person. It's Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft. There was a moment when Bill Gates had $10 billion. None of us can count that high. It's hard to even grasp $1 million, much less $1 billion. But what did he do with his 10 billion? He invested it. And within 2 decades, he had 130 billion. Now, that's laughable. That is absurd. And yet we don't laugh. So the first norm of this system is that no amount of wealth is ever enough. I call it the myth of maximizing. No amount of wealth is ever enough. However much you have, you're going to invest it, and you need to have even more. So you mentioned financialization. So this system, this capital-centric system, was let loose back in the 1980s. Reagan, deregulation, cutting taxes. It's been in overdrive for decades. Well, guess what happens? You pile up financial wealth in greater and greater and greater amounts, and that wealth is created. Now this is part of the language. We say that the stock market creates wealth. It does nothing of the sort. It extracts wealth. This is what we don't understand about wealth. Wealth has an underside that we don't talk about. We pretend, when I say we, I mean the system, there's this, it lives in this fantasy world that wealth just falls from the sky. It's pristine, it's unblemished. This is probably what it felt like to be a white living in South Africa before apartheid fell. You know, you're protected. You don't realize how you're being protected. You don't want to look at what's being done on your behalf. You just want to be safe and secure. And this is what our system does for the wealthy. And so, but and this is something that economists have warned about for decades, and that is financialization. That when you get too much financial wealth in the system, particularly in too few hands, it becomes a destructive force. It's very much like carbon emissions.
Yeah.
You know, driving your car, heating your home, those are good things, right? You do too much of it and you destabilize the entire ecology of the planet. You know, having some more wealth in your portfolio, wow, that's a nice thing. You get too much of that and you destabilize the entire society. You throw workers out of work, you evade taxes, you extract from the earth. Why isn't ExxonMobil stopping this extraction? Because it's serving its shareholders. It's doing what it believes it is supposed to be doing, or pretends it believes this. So it becomes this this very destructive force, and we don't recognize this. Now, you mentioned, you know, the gender and racial gap. So what how I look at this is that capitalism, particularly financialized capitalism, is really the apex of the patriarchal system. It's a patriarchal way of thinking. Some people matter, some people don't. Some people exist to serve, other people exist to be served. And that's true of gender relations and race relations and capital and worker relations. So these are all relations of power. And the power of financial wealth today is the greatest power the world has ever known, far greater than even imperial power, which at one time Europe controlled 85% of the earth through imperial possessions. Now, so capitalism began with racial extraction. It was racial capitalism. There was slavery, you know, black bodies were turned literally into property, the property of white people, white wealthy people, men. And then also nations, entire nations, particularly in Africa, were captured as the overseas possessions of colonial Europe. And of course, native land in the U.S. was taken for white settlers. And so the initial wealth of the system was racialized. And what is so what people of color, the suffering that they have known for so long, and is still continuing, is now hitting white people. It's now hitting, you know, so the system will extract from wherever it can. And no amount of wealth is ever enough. So it's going to go on. It's capitalizing ecosystem services. Look at AI. It's going to be putting so many jobs out of work. And I'll just say briefly about gender. This whole mindset of capitalism is a male. I shouldn't say male, because there's a lot of good men, but there's a kind of a classic, I think, patriarchal thinking about who matters and who doesn't. And women are more inclined toward care jobs, and those are devalued. And what's valued? People who are running portfolios, people who are running corporations, which is mostly men. 98% of investment assets are controlled by companies owned by white men. So that's the mindset that's in charge.
Yeah, so Marjorie, you just touched on so many things, and you talk about these myths, right? That uphold the whole wealth supremacist system, right? And one of them, like you said, is the myth of maximizing, right? And I even say this to folks when I say, is there too much profit? And they're like, well, we should be able to make profit. I'm like, and I'm saying, we're not saying people should not be able to make some profit, right? But maximizing, like you said, where there's no end in sight, at the cost of people's lives and the cost of our planet. That's really what the myth of maximizing. And I want to talk a little bit more about another myth, because you brought up some things about work, right? And basically our economic system was built on a system of slavery, which was it's all about suppressing labor costs, right? It's all about minimizing our labor costs, but also controlling resources, like taking land from the indigenous people. So, I mean, our whole current capitalistic system is built on exploitation of the indigenous people by taking their land and then finding ways to have slave labor. And even race was constructed to justify the dehumanization of Black people, right? And also to separate white people from Black people, right? So there's that narrative when working class whites are saying, oh, it's all those poor people taking money from us. That's the narrative, right? When actually, no, you're being exploited as much as as other poor or working class Black and brown folks. So there's a myth of corporate governance. This is very scary. And it's direct impact on workers, right? And you talked a little bit about occupational segregation, which occurs when one demographic group is overrepresented or underrepresented in certain job categories. And we know that occupational segregation is a driver of the gender wealth gap, because occupations dominated by women are valued less and therefore paid less. But what is this myth of corporate governance about, and how is it impacting even the concept of employment, employees?
Right. Yeah, the myth of corporate governance is that workers are not members of the corporation. I mean, a worker can go to a company for 40 years and these workers can keep the place running. You call up the company, the workers answer the phone, right? They make the products. They have no claim on the wealth they help to create. They have no voice in governance. Workers are dispossessed and disenfranchised, much as people of color and women once were in the political system. Workers still are in the property system. And on the other hand, investors in a hedge fund, which might hold shares for 15 minutes, they have a voice, they have a say, they have a vote in corporate governance. And that means electing the board. And the board of directors hires and fires the CEO and sets that person's pay. So capital is really in charge of corporations. We blame CEOs, but really capital is really in charge. And we take this as a norm. And this, I mean, workers for the most part are not clamoring to have seats on the board. I mean, we take it as one of these invisible norms. And it's a lot of it is because we consider corporations to be objects, and they're owned by shareholders, and therefore shareholders have the power over it. It was Martin Luther King who said that racism thingified Blacks and Black bodies. Well, capitalism thingifies everything in the world. It turns everything into an asset that it wants to own and extract from. And corporations, in truth, are not really objects. They're human communities. And if we saw them as human communities, we would govern them differently.
Yeah, and there's another myth you talk about, the myth of fiduciary duty, which I think is really important to talk about, because I think it's related to this, right? It's the balance sheets, it's your income sheets, right? Looking at expenses versus revenue. So, and there's some financial advisors here, wealth managers here, I'm sure, listening. So how does that myth what is that myth, and how does that?
Well, there's sort of two that you're referring to. So there's a myth of the income statement. And the income statement, you want to talk about language. This is Greek to most people, but it's a simple statement that every company uses. It basically means you have money coming in, that's revenue. You have money coming out, that's expenses, and what's left over is profit. That's basically the income statement. But hidden in that is sort of a trick of language, and that is that income to capital is called profit. And profit is great. You're supposed to have as much of it as possible. You're supposed to do anything you can to drive up profit. Income to labor is called expense. Expense is bad. You're supposed to drive it down. You're supposed to have as little of it as possible. So the very structure of the income statement tells companies, pay labor as little as possible, pay capital as much as possible. And that's embedded in just the design of the income statement. And so then you mentioned the myth of fiduciary duty. And this is what governs capital markets. This is what governs investing. And the myth says that advisors and managers of wealth must maximize the value of their clients' assets. You must maximize, it's called risk-adjusted return to investors. And that's just a norm. That's a norm of investing. There isn't really a legal requirement that you do that. I mean, investors will pull their assets if you don't get them high enough returns. So there's structural reasons that this myth has some validity. But really what fiduciary duty requires is prudence. You have to be prudent. You know, you can't, if I'm managing your money, Diane, I can't run off and give it to some crazy uncle or or go to the Bahamas. You know, I have to be prudent in how I manage it. And that's real. And that's important. But what we don't recognize is that hidden inside fiduciary duty, there's this second norm, which says gains to capital matter, nothing else matters. And so if Exxon destroys the planet in order to create returns for shareholders, well, they're following their fiduciary duty. And you see there the insanity. It's the insanity embedded in the norms of the system.
So I want to pull in philanthropy into this. We're a nonprofit organization, right? And we always have to raise money, and we have an endowment fund, and a lot of these foundations have large endowments, right?
Mm-hmm.
Billions of dollars are sitting in these endowments, gaining more interest, right? And oftentimes, when we have wealth managers managing our endowments, and they often say, you know, too risky to increase the amount of money you want to take out. You know, we want to make sure we maximize your return, right?
Right.
And at Women's Way, we're like, well, first of all, what companies are we investing in through our endowment? So, and when you really look at some of the companies that some foundations are investing in, they're doing horrible things, right? But we're making money off of that. And my other issue with this is so little money now require, you know, people take like a 5% distribution or whatever, and they take that and they then they distribute it to communities to address these inequities. Yet I would argue that philanthropy is part of the problem, the way it's structured. And so, you know, what, and I know there's people on this listening right now that are funders, that are working at foundations. You know, what do they need to think about, you know, in terms of their work and how they're managing their assets?
Sure. This is good, Diane. I have some assets, my wife and I do, and you know, I want to be comfortable in retirement. You know, there's nothing wrong with having a little bit of wealth. We all should, right? We should all have some economic freedom and security, and but it shouldn't be this, you know, eight or 10 people have 40% of the world's wealth. So I want to sort of set our hearts at ease a little bit. You're not a bad person if you have a little bit of wealth. But I think what this also points to is what I call the dream world of wealth. That when you look at your investment statements, it looks like money falls from the sky. Oh, I got 6%. Gosh, I wish I had 8%. You know, wouldn't everybody want 8% rather than 6%? And it doesn't tell you how many people were laid off at this company in order to increase the share price. It doesn't tell you how many jobs were sent overseas in order to increase their share price. It doesn't tell you, you know, when you hold an index fund, and probably DuPont is in that index fund. And so we all are silently hoping for the value of chemical assets to rise. And so the insect apocalypse is built in. You know, we track the returns of the Dow Jones Industrial Average minute by minute. The Wall Street Journal literally has a chart, the Dow minute by minute through the day.
Yep.
Insects, we've lost 75% of insects over the last 50 years, and nobody noticed. We don't count insects, but we count the Dow minute by minute by minute. So we unconsciously, and I think without thinking, participate in this dream world of wealth that money falls from the sky. And so waking up is about recognizing, no, it doesn't. There is an underside to wealth. I mean, wealth relies on the indebtedness and precarity of most people. A lot of wealth is debt. So what do we do about this? How do we, well, you know, one of the things that I've been tracking as a journalist for decades is the field of what was classically called socially responsible investing. These days they call it ESG, which means looking at environmental, social governance. You know, and I'd be happy to have a more private conversation with some people if you'd like. But ESG is basically a crock. My wife works in the in social investing field, and we knew Joan Bavaria well. She's one of the founders. This socially responsible investing used to be about using the power of capital to make a better world. And there are still people who do that. Impact investing, and remember that phrase, impact investing, that's the best. Now, these are hard to come by. We haven't built, I like to say that, you know, we've built super highways to invest in Wall Street, and we have dirt roads if we want to invest in the community, or local investing or impact investing. The infrastructure is still being built, but you need to do as much as you can of impact investing. And there's more of it than people realize. And if your advisor tells you you can't do it and it's too risky, get a new advisor.
I totally agree with that. We changed ours because we want someone to really understand how you can use investing in a way to promote more equity. And we can, like you just said, with impact investing. And I actually had a question about that, because a lot of people listening might be like, oh my God, this is overwhelming. It's daunting. Like, oh my God, how do we ever, that's another myth. We can't change the system, right? It's too big. It's too big. It's too much. It's too much power. It's got too much momentum, and it does have a lot of that, right? But you talk about a pathway to really move from an extractive economy to what you call more of a democratic economy. And one of the things you talk about is boost local investing. I just want to elaborate a little bit on that. We know that women entrepreneurs are the fastest growing group in the country, yet receive less than 3% of all venture capital. And Black and brown women entrepreneurs receive less than 1%. So, and we have things like Impact PHL. I don't know if you know about them, but they do a lot around really boosting local investing. So how do we boost more local investing, and who is already doing this work? And I do want to shout out for Impact PHL, who is doing this work in the Philadelphia region. But I'd love to hear.
Yeah. There's a really here's an example. There's a really wonderful group called, I think it's called A&H Capital. And these are some young Black men who are really visionary. And they've started a fund that's going to purchase and convert companies to employee ownership. And they particularly want to benefit people of color, workers of color. And so they do that by focusing on industries where predominantly people of color are employed. They bought a lawn care company, and I forget how many others. Our organization helped start the Fund for Employee Ownership in Cleveland, which is a majority community of color, and we helped to start the Evergreen Commercial Cooperative Laundry. It's a commercial laundry. It's a green laundry. It employs about 200 people, many of them formerly incarcerated, and the vast majority are workers of color, and they use local big anchors locally purchased there. Cleveland Clinic takes all its laundry to this place. So it's an example of a company that benefits the community, it benefits people of color, and by the way, it does fabulous work, and that's why Cleveland Clinic is going there. And then there was such success with these companies, we said, well, let's start a fund to buy existing companies and convert to employee ownership. There's a growing community of these kinds of funds. It's one example of investing in order to build a democratic economy.
Yep.
You still get a reasonable return. There are a lot of these kinds of opportunities. I feel like I've wandered away from your question, Diane.
No. It's about how do we boost local investing, and there are already people doing it. There are already
Right.
examples of this. And I see a question by Vicky Kramer, and the question is: you seem to be attacking capitalism as a system. What is the alternative you are proposing?
Mm-hmm.
Does it exist somewhere in the world, and how does it work? I mean, it's a big question,
These are
right?
great. It's a great question. It's
Yeah,
a fair question.
it's a great question.
The alternative is a democratic economy, and this is, half my book is about that. And I do encourage you to look at the book. You don't have to read the whole thing, but I think you'll be encouraged. So a democratic economy is designed for all of us, right? Within a livable earth, in fact, a flourishing earth. And there are countless kinds of models: worker ownership, public banks. Bank of North Dakota is owned by the state, and its purpose is to serve the state, not to extract from it. And it kept lending after the 2008 meltdown. All the big banks around the country froze and stopped lending. This bank kept lending, and North Dakota has more community banks than any other state because this big state bank exists to serve them. It's a workable model. There's a movement for state banks all over the country starting to catch on. So where does it exist? Our organization, the Democracy Collaborative, we have devised a form of local economic development that we call community wealth building. And this is basically the next system growing at the local level. And I talked a little bit about Cleveland, how we did the worker-owned laundry there with support of local anchor institutions. That inspired a model in Preston, England. And the city council there took up community wealth building, and they actually moved the needle on unemployment. This was a Rust Belt broken down city. It was recently named the most livable place to raise a family in the UK. So they moved the needle on community well-being with community wealth building. The entire nation of Scotland right now has taken up community wealth building as its model. Every county in Scotland is drawing up a community wealth building plan. Now, community wealth building says it helps to transform local economies by communities having ownership and control of their own assets, right? We're not being controlled by absentee Wall Street. We're owning and controlling our own assets, and we're using models that keep wealth local and keep it circulating. So that's an example of the next economy growing at the local level. And in fact, there's more interest around the world in this model than we can keep up with. We drew up a plan for Chicago. We're working with Los Angeles and so on. So you'll find a report on this on our website, democracycollaborative.org.
That's great, Marjorie. And we will be doing a future session on community wealth building later in the year to do a deeper dive. But what you just shared with folks got some more people asking questions here. So and again, please, I encourage everyone to drop questions in the Q&A. This is from Valerie Cheney. She says, can you share a little about investor-owned credit unions? Can this be a solution to create democratic economies?
Credit unions are great. And I saw the request to slow down. I tend to get excited and
me too.
Fast. So let me slow down. Credit unions are actually owned by their depositors. That's what the nature, they're a form of cooperative. And they have, I can't state the number, but it's over $1 trillion in assets. They're quite substantial. And yes, they exist to serve their community, not to extract maximum profits. They do make a profit. I make a distinction between profit making and profit maximizing. There's a key difference. So yes, credit unions are a huge, I think, boon for our local economies. I would also add that there are municipally owned utilities, both electricity and water. And these have been shown to provide superior service at lower cost. Again, because you're not trying to extract all this profit for
Yep.
absentee investors.
Excellent. And Tamara Brown asks, is there somewhere to get copies of the models that you're talking about? So they can learn more about these models that are grounded more in democratized, like a democratic economy.
Yes, I would advise you to take a look at my previous book. It's called The Making of a Democratic Economy. I talk about Preston, I talk about Cleveland, and there's a whole appendix in that book that says all these organizations. There are organizations for worker ownership, organizations for creating state banks. I list all of them there. So that's a good place to get started. Yeah.
And then from Veronica, have you seen success in the application of shared economies?
Yeah, so by shared economies, I mean, I think that's what a democratic economy is. It's, for example, let me give one example, and this is, let's talk about manufactured housing communities, mobile home parks. And there is a movement to help these communities buy the land that their manufactured homes sit upon. And then the residents can manage this land and charge reasonable rents. On the other hand, there's a movement also by private equity to buy up these communities and then raise the rents in order to extract more for investors. And there's a group in New Hampshire. It started in New Hampshire. The New Hampshire Community Loan Fund created this model, and you can invest in the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. I have a little bit of money invested in them. They started something called ROC USA, resident-owned communities, in order to spread this model. And they have a fund. I think a philanthropy could invest in it. I don't think individuals can, but institutions can. And then they also have technical assistance providers around the country. So they're out there actively trying to convert these mobile home communities into resident-owned communities. That's an example of the shared economy working.
Yeah, that's a beautiful example. And I just want to kind of elaborate on this pathway going from an extractive economic system to a democratic economic system. And you talk about this pathway like naming, right? So we talked about how do we name it first? How do we delegitimize the bias, right? How do we really create this sense of necessity? And I love the fact that we always want to talk about positive things and solutions, obviously really important, but if we don't have a sense of crisis or urgency, people don't act as much. So I think having this sense of urgency is really critical. And then imagination, right? And I love this idea of it starts with our minds, that we have to free ourselves to imagine something that's different, that's different from our current economic system. And then you talk about demonstrating alternative economic models, and then pathways to expand democratic models, right? And to restrain financial extraction. I want to go back to philanthropy because I think philanthropy can play a role in really investing in these models of alternative economic models, right? Not only testing them, pilot testing them, but then also how do we then expand, be able to invest in expanding them, which is also, you could also do that through your own investment. So I'm just saying I think you really create a pathway for moving from this extractive economy to one that's grounded more in democratic principles. And so another thing I want to talk about is wealth extraction. We're talking about, we need to do wealth building, right? And sharing of wealth, but we also need to slow down wealth extraction, which is happening. And you talk about, one of them is about debt, school debt, college debt, right? And you talk about advancing debt jubilee.
Mhm.
And I just want to share that we know that 2/3 of all college debt is held by women, and school debt is one of the key drivers of the gender wealth gap. So let's talk a little bit about debt forgiveness and who's doing this work.
I love talking about debt forgiveness. This was new to me when I wrote the book. And there's two groups that I want to do a shout out to. And one is the Debt Collective. This is a very powerful citizen group. I understand that it came out of Occupy Wall Street, actually. And they're working to forgive all kinds of debt. From what I understand is that they were the ones who persuaded Biden to pursue the forgiveness of student loan debt, which became a huge policy success. He had to try a couple different ways because he was being blocked, but he has forgiven a lot of student debt. But they're working against medical debt and all kinds of debt. Very, very wonderful group. And there's another group, it's called RIP Medical Debt. And RIP, that's of course, rest in peace. That's, you're dead and gone. RIP Medical Debt. So this is, I think philanthropists could participate in this. Churches, there's, I think, maybe 500 or 600 churches that participate in this. It was started by a couple of debt collectors. Now, when debt becomes hard to collect, people are not paying, it's way overdue. Places sell this debt. Hospitals will sell their debt. And they'll sell it to a debt collector, and the debt collector will buy it for maybe a penny on the dollar, right? And then they squeeze these people. So they try to get 2 or 3 or 10 cents on the dollar by squeezing people, calling them at all hours of the day and the night, and so on. But they were told by these by the debt collecting people, well, you could actually forgive that debt. So for $1 of philanthropic contribution, you can forgive $100 worth of debt. Right?
Wow.
It's really quite dramatic. And so a lot of churches have done this. You can it's huge leverage. And in fact, I recently read that there was a historically Black college where their student debt was taken on and forgiven by philanthropists. So and what is powerful, I think, what is system changing about this is it explodes the idea that all debt must entirely be paid. It's not true of business. Businesses negotiate their way out of debt all the time.
They do.
Bankruptcy for business is easier. They made it hard for consumers. But to realize, no debt needs to be forgiven now and then. And that's actually a biblical concept. The year of Jubilee was declared every 50 years in Judaic times, and debts were forgiven.
Well, I know some people personally that a lot of their college school debt was forgiven, and what it does emotionally to folks, the stress that it lifts off of their shoulders and their minds. I mean, we talk about wealth, being able to just breathe and feel free. I mean, debt is this huge emotional burden, and it really disproportionately impacts women, particularly women of color. So I'm glad that people are doing more debt relief programs and that this is becoming more of a norm. And I want to talk about intergenerational wealth gap. Kelly talked about this, you talked about it. I mean, this started long time ago, right? And instead of having, white people and transferring their wealth to the next generation, many people, particularly people of color, and women of color, because of sexism and racism and all the isms, pass on debt to their family. So let's talk a little bit about rebalancing the intergenerational wealth gap. How do we rebalance the wealth gap, and what role can reparations play in rebalancing the generational wealth gap?
Yeah, I think in all of this democratic economy work, we need to forefront racial equity in particular, because that's where so much extraction has occurred. And it's a principle of every economy that, if you damage someone or someone's property or their assets, you have to pay for it, right? So people of color have been damaged, and reparations are necessary. And one example that we learned about, I did a wonderful gathering a summer a year ago about, how would you create a next system of capital? Could you create an entire next system that was of finance and capital that was really democratic? And I determined, to my satisfaction, that you can. That actually, and I have a whole chapter on that. But one of the pathways that we looked at was, so you don't want to get rid of wealth, right? In the same way that we didn't want to get rid of men. You want to get rid of sexism, but men are still going to be there. You don't want to get rid of wealth, but what you want to do is you want to compress it.
Yes.
So people, everyone ought to have a chance to start life with, some assets on your side. So there's the idea of baby bonds.
Yep.
That a gift of a particular level of assets is made to disadvantaged children when they're born. Washington, D.C. is looking at such a program. I think there's another place that has such a program. So that's a lovely, I think, intervention. At the same time, you want to suppress the top. So you don't want so much, you don't want dynasties built generation after generation. And so you need wealth taxes, and you need inheritance taxes. And there's a wonderful group I've started to work with. They're called Patriotic Millionaires. And these are people of modest wealth who are saying, tax us. We ought to tax wealthy people more than we do. So that's a very powerful movement.
That's a very powerful movement, which I think is really important to be aware of, right? So there's ways to generate wealth, there's ways to decrease wealth extraction, but we have to how do we stop what's happening at the top of the economic pyramid? So it's great that you have some wealthy people that are actually saying, yes, we need to stop maximizing this wealth, right? These profits. Mm-hmm. And someone actually asked, and I was going to bring it up too, I think it was Janine. She said, is there room in a discussion for a basic income for all, or universal income? And there are at least 3 pilots now in Philadelphia looking at guaranteeing universal income. What do you think? I mean, have you explored that model? And
a little bit. I think it's probably going to be necessary. I was having this conversation over the breakfast table with my wife recently. We were talking about artificial intelligence, AI, and how many jobs are going to be destroyed by that. And we may get to the point where you're just going to need to have basic income, universal income, just to keep people afloat. So yes, I definitely support it. I think we need to be careful not to look at it as the only solution, because I think that's a dismal world. If you have billionaires getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, remember those 8 or 10 men doubled their wealth in a few years. That's going to happen. That's mathematically, that's how the system works. It's simple math. If you leave this system to run, there will be more and more wealth at the top, and it will come from extracting from the rest of us, destroying our jobs, destroying the planet. And so a little bit of a basic income is it's not going to be a pretty world.
Right. So it sounds like we have to have strategies and models that are eliminating the wealth accumulation at the top while building wealth for people at the bottom by minimizing wealth extraction. I mean, these are all parts of what needs to happen, right, to move from this extractive economy to a democratic economy. So let me just ask some questions with specific groups, right? So we started talking about this, but what action steps can financial advisors and wealth managers take to help build a more democratic economy? And you talk a lot about the financial industry. I think it was financial, insurance, real estate are really at the core of driving this gap, this wealth gap, right? So we have financial advisors and wealth managers listening. What can they do to help build a more democratic economy?
Well, I think the very first thing that they can do is to educate their clients, to say, maybe maximum income is not really the goal here. What is the purpose of wealth? What purpose does capital serve in our society? And, are you interested in helping to make a better world? Now, maybe not all clients will be interested in that, but hopefully people will be interested in not doing harm, not increasing their own wealth by harming others. And so I think making transparent what is happening. Are you investing in fossil fuels? Is that where you want to be invested? Are you invested in chemical assets? How about weapons? Is this what you want to be fueling? Do you want to be fueling that kind of world? Or, do you want to be fueling worker ownership? Or, are you investing locally? Can you, are your bank assets in a local bank or a credit union? So, yeah, I think that there's, and I also think that financial advisors can work together for some of these larger solutions. And really, I would love to see that. I've started to talk to some financial advisors about what I've started to call subversive investing. Let's subvert the dominant paradigm.
I love it. I'm going to write that down.
While we get some kind of income. So I'm going to be writing about that. I haven't yet, but there are, you may need, if you're a financial advisor, you may need to become a renegade. You may need to seek out some of these firms that are socially responsible. And there are some investing firms. And we need to reinvigorate socially responsible investing as a huge tool to make a better world. And I think there are a lot of clients who would be very excited about that.
Yeah, and going to clients, I mean, I think we can drive changes in the financial industry by asking those questions. And if they're not answering those questions, then we change. Financial advice, we're not going to work with you, right?
And tell them why you changed.
And tell them why we changed. And like I said, we changed to another wealth, and because they really have a whole process where they assess the companies we're investing in with a gender and racial equity lens. Are they really moving towards this? Do they really believe, are there practices like this? So there's definitely more movement, but also instead of waiting just for advisors to change, we as investors, whether it's an individual, a foundation, whatever, you have a donor advised fund, you can drive these changes.
Right.
Right. So I'm just.
And we can ask that of our institutions too. I mean, for example, Harvard is about 60 or 70% invested in private equity and hedge funds. And those are pretty opaque. It's hard to know what's going on inside them. But I will say this, that when fossil fuel companies have been urged by investors to get rid of their dirtiest assets, and many of them, some of the big ones they've sold off their very dirtiest assets. Well, guess who bought those? It was private equity. Yes. And in some cases, private equity is doubling or tripling production. So what has happened is that these dirty assets have just moved into the shadows. And I think that institutional investors are probably holding some of these assets and not even aware of it. And so look at private equity, look at hedge funds, and don't just look at the number of the return. Ask them, what are they invested in?
Yep. Yeah. Great. And I have a few more questions, and we're getting close to the end here. Tamara Brown, not sure, are there things the wealthy do that the general population do that increase their wealth? Sure, if you understand.
Help me understand what.
I'm not sure if are there things the wealthy do that the general population do that increase their wealth? I'm not sure if we understand your question.
Well, I guess the thing that I would say that it's important for us to understand is that we're in what one person called an era of financial manager capitalism. Wealthy people do not control their own assets. They're not deciding where to invest for the most part. they're placing their money with financial advisors and financial managers. And so, we have this old picture of the greedy capitalist, the top hat and the cigar. And, that's a very old picture. And now it's financial managers who really have the power. But what they will say is, well, I have a fiduciary duty to just act on my client's behalf. And so there's a way that the system is on autopilot.
Yeah.
That nobody feels responsible. Nobody feels possible to change the system, and it just kind of grinds on. And I think it's really important that we understand that, because I think it's human nature to think about evil people as the problem, and we want to go find the evil people and root them out. And a system problem is different. And I think we know this from racism, right?
Yep.
Racism is a system problem, and it's not just about those evil people who are overtly racist. Racism is pervasive, and
Yep.
recognizing it in ourselves, I think, is really critical to rooting it out. And so I think recognizing how this problem is systemic,
Yep.
Is really critical.
Yeah, and I want to just elaborate on that, because I think a lot of people think the system is this other thing out there, right? And we're not part of it, and yet we are. In many ways, our actions, our thinking, our behaviors uphold the current system. So and it goes back to starting, change starts with here, our minds, right? And how we understand it and our role in upholding it. And I have definitely upheld it in many ways without intentionally, but, and so even when we did our anti-racist work at Women's Way, we people are like, oh, what are you going to give us, like, we're going to come up with policies and practices? And I said, no, we're going to hire consultants to challenge our internalized white supremacy and racism that exists in all of us, because the change starts with us. So that's why I think, naming and understanding how the system works, but then reflecting on how do I, as an individual, investor, a head of a nonprofit, whatever it is, right? How am I upholding this, right? And then what can I do to change it? So I think it's a very powerful thing to think about. So I have another question. We probably have room for another couple more. This is kind of a big question from my friend Richard Binswanger. Do you think this will require a revolution that wealth is taken away from the wealthy, or evolution where that extraction is more voluntary?
It's a good question. I don't think a revolution will work. I don't think that, toppling, this is not as simple as toppling one leader and putting a new leader in place, which is often how political revolutions happen. I think that a revolution in an economy is about replacing one property system with another. So instead of thinking of financial assets as existing to maximize themselves into eternity, we begin to see an economy exist to keep us alive and prosperous. And these are all the things that Kelly talked about at the start. Redefining wealth.
Right.
Wealth is being secure, having a healthy community. Kelly, that was brilliant. I love that. That's a revolution.
Yep.
Changing our minds about what the nature of wealth is. That's a revolution. And I think, and then, participating in that. And I think openings will come. We're in a time of breakdown. I don't think there's a straight line between where we are and building the democratic economy, like, boom, we're going to get there quickly, or by some direct route. But what I will say, that we don't need to create the conditions for this system to break down. It's already happening. It's creating its own conditions of breakdown because it isn't sustainable.
Yep.
And I think we need to be growing the future in our imagination, in our collective behavior, and then looking for the openings that allow us to advance it. It'll take time. I'm hopeful. Maybe I'm naive. I don't think I am, but maybe I am. And if I am, I'll just plant my flag there.
Well, I'm hopeful too, Marjorie. We didn't get here in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. So it's going to take a while. And I know that I will not see before I die what I'd like to see, but hopefully I'll see progress, right? And I think that's what keeps me hopeful, is there is progress. I mean, the fact that we're even talking about this, I mean, I remember 5 years ago, even white supremacy, well, people didn't talk about that. And now this
Mhm,
concept of wealth supremacy, these are conversations that are very new to a lot of people, right?
mhm.
Including me. And I think it all, again, starts with conversations and talking about this and having an
Yes.
understanding, right?
Mhm.
So that's partly why we do this work, is having these conversations, right? And continuing these conversations. Um, and so I have two more questions here, and I want to make sure we answer the questions from Pamela. Can you say anything about rethinking pension investments?
Mm. Uh, Not a lot, to tell you the truth. People have the misperception that, say, for example, union pension funds should be activists for change. And I've worked a little bit with union pension funds, and they are the most hamstrung, the most constrained because of ERISA rules. They may actually be required to maximize returns for their participants. Whereas, for example, foundations, universities, individuals all have a lot more freedom to pursue different goals. We probably need to change ERISA rules. I can't say that I'm an expert on that, but I'm sure there are people who are thinking about it. And I think in the meanwhile, pensions in general are not the problem, right? Pensions are ordinary people having some security.
Yep,
Let's look at the billionaires. That's where the problem is. I think we should focus there first.
yep, I agree. And I have one last question. It's a great question. How can we explain these complex concepts and ideas to populations that are very new to all this thinking and may not be as educated and or have cultural mind shifts to overcome? It's a great question.
It's a great question. And I think what Women's Way is doing with this event here today is an example of this. At the Democracy Collaborative, we're also working on this. I would like, for example, to do one of those simple whiteboard videos. They just last a couple of minutes, and you draw quickly and you show how the system works. I really want to work on being able to explain these things in simpler and simpler
Yep,
terms. And that's a challenge. I think it's a challenge for all of us. And I think understanding it ourselves, talking to each other, I can't emphasize too much how important it is to talk to each other. Think how much we talk about climate change. And that has become
right,
a pretty,
right,
pretty well-known concept, even though it started out pretty complicated.
right.
Um, I think it's similar. I think we'll get there. We need to just keep talking to each other.
Well, I get, it's partly this whole relationship we have with money
Uh-huh.
and finances. It's like, oh, that's something I don't do, or wealth, oh, that's something I don't think about. And I think that's part of the narratives that we hear, particularly for women. And so I think we just have to be more comfortable and start having these conversations about how the
Mhm.
economic system and how financialization is working. And so I think, getting more comfortable, and with your work and Marjorie giving us language to
Mhm.
actually talk about this is something that's very powerful. And even having concrete examples of different models is something that I think is really important. And we will be talking about those in more depth throughout the year, through the Closing the Gender Wealth Gap series. And someone just made a point about, well, what if I don't have money for financial advising or stuff? There are programs out there. In fact, we have a financial wellness program that we're offering to folks, because we don't talk about money. It's like
Mhm.
we don't we it's like a taboo, right? And yet that's the basis of our capitalistic system, is our form of trade. So I think having these conversations, getting more comfortable with it, having the language, naming things, and having concrete examples of what different economic models look like, right? Which is what your book does. So I'm going to give a little bit here. Read Marjorie's book. It is such it just gives you so much knowledge and understanding. And I think you break it down and in a really understandable way, at least for me. So I think, and there's other resources we will be sharing with you too. So I think it's just really reading and learning more about all this, right, Marjorie, and having these conversations.
So much. And, you know, my publisher has very generously arranged for a 30% discount if people are interested. Was that put in the chat?
I don't think so yet.
So
I think Kelly was,
bkconnection.com.
oh, there it is. We got it. Yes, Athada, thank you.
And the code is friends.
It's friends. And also the Free Library of Philadelphia has actually purchased some of Marjorie's books, so you can actually just take it out of the library. So thank you, Free Library. They've also publicized this event. So it's about 5:25. I'm going to say thank you first, Marjorie. Awesome discussion. Thank you for the work you are doing. You are such a leader in this area, and I know how much work that it takes to even write a book like this. So thank you for spending time with us this evening. And I want to pass it on. Well, go ahead if you want to say anything.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. And I want to say again, Kelly, I'm so impressed by your opener. I just feel like you are an interpreter of taking complex concepts and making them simple. So you know, you're doing great. So this has been great fun. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you both. Give me just a second. Everyone stay for just a moment. We have more to share. Oy vey.
Goes from Kurt, yeah.
All right. Great. There we go. All right. So much food for thought. This was, my goodness, a buffet of ideas and concepts and new pathways and models. So thank you to Marjorie. Thank you to Diane for facilitating such a wonderful conversation and connecting the dots and helping us think all this through. We want to thank each and every one of you in the audience for your attendance and participation and engagement in the conversation. The series is ongoing, so we'll continue to explore closing the gender wealth gap with dates and topics listed here on the slide. So we are excited to welcome you back. We're also moving into a solution space as we think about closing the gender wealth gap. So for those of you who are wondering, what can I do? Where can I find some hope? We want you to join us to learn more about how our communities are reimagining a more just economy. We also want to continue the conversation in all sorts of levels about wealth inequality and engage more with you, our partners and community. So we'd like you to join us for a free in-person photo exhibition and panel at the Free Library of Philadelphia on January 31st. Registration info is in the chat. This is a great way for you to continue to familiarize yourself with the concept, talk to people who are interested in it as well, and gain more insights. And it's a sort of creative way to do that. So we look forward to having you join us on January 31st. We encourage you to support Marjorie's book. So the discount code for the book was put into the chat. So 30% off, that is a boon. Thank you for sharing that. And it's also available, as mentioned, at the Free Library. So if you'd like to take the book out on loan, you can do it there. Finally, please take the survey and let us know what worked for you about this conversation and what you'd like to see, what you'd like to chat about, what you want to learn more about. Check out our social media and website for more announcements on events and more programming. We can't wait to see you. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Marjorie and Diane, for an awesome conversation. And we'll see everyone in person on the 31st. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.